Hello and welcome to the second review of Request Month 2022. This is Velvet Assassin for PC, Mac, and Xbox 360. What you're seeing here is the PC version, which was sent to me for reviewing by TylerBoy565. Thank you for that, it is greatly appreciated. This is a stealth game developed by Replay Studios and published by South Peak Games in 2009 for PC and Xbox 360, with the Mac version following 4 years later in 2013. It wasn't very well received when it first came out, and it ended up being a bit of a commercial failure for Replay Studios, which, when combined with their other commercial failure released the same year, Tunnel Rats, ultimately led to the studio's closure after only having developed 3 games. Which of course brings up the question of whether or not Velvet Assassin was just a weakly received game when it first came out but is actually a hidden gem, or whether it actually deserved that reputation. And more importantly, what does it actually bring to the table, because it is a fairly interesting game in some ways, most notably the game's inspiration, which was the British-French spy Violette Szabo. She operated in occupied France during World War II, and was unfortunately captured by the Germans and eventually executed for it. But she's a pretty interesting figure, and she had numerous awards and honors after her death for her efforts during the war, so using her as the inspiration for a game, or certainly a movie or something like that, is actually pretty interesting. Of course, it's important to make the distinction that this is inspired by Violette Szabo, not based on her. So it's not trying to be a recreation of her missions or her actual life or anything like that. It just uses her as an inspiration for the completely fictional character that you play as and the completely fictional missions that you go on. It's also important to mention that this game does have a few compatibility issues with modern setups, so you might have to tinker with some of the settings, maybe cap the frame rate, things like that. And because this game used an old implementation of PhysX, and you're running an NVIDIA graphics card, you're going to need to make sure you install the legacy PhysX driver, otherwise it'll cause some crashing problems. None of that is really all that big of a deal, but it is something that is worth mentioning if you're thinking about maybe giving this game a try. Which of course brings me to the central question of Velvet Assassin. Is the weak reception this game had on launch actually justified, or is it more of a hidden gem that was unfairly maligned and thus was not all that good of a seller? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on the Replay engine, the custom in-house engine Replay Studios made, and it does have some pretty impressive effects to it, most notably the lighting, which, despite this game now being well over a decade old, actually still holds up extremely well. They definitely put a lot of work in making the shadows pop, and that's definitely a good thing because the shadows play an important role in the stealth mechanics. Aside from that, however, the rest of the game is definitely a very mixed bag. The texture quality is about what you would expect from an Xbox 360 port circa 2009, which is to say that it's not very good, and some of the textures look downright awful. And while the modeling is overall pretty good, the animations are very rough. The actual weapon handling animations just look like a total amateur made them, and even clip through the hands in many instances, which just looks terrible. But by far the worst aspect of the visuals is the motion blur, which there is no option in any of the game's settings to turn off. You have to go into the config files to modify it. And honestly, I really didn't feel like doing that, so I played through the entire thing with motion blur on, and in several instances it was intense enough that it almost made me nauseous. It is really awful motion blur, and it's only on camera movement too, which is what makes it so obnoxious. So if you are at all interested in giving the game a try, definitely make sure you disable the motion blur, because it's terrible. But then there's the one thing about the game that is not a visual quality issue, but rather an aesthetic one. And that aesthetic choice ties in directly with the game's tone, or at least the tone that it is attempting to achieve. You see, Velvet Assassin is trying so very hard to be a dark and gritty game. And while I'll explain more about that tone that it's attempting to achieve throughout the rest of the video, in the visual department, that manifests most notably in the hallucinations that Violette has, which are mostly interspersed into the game in various very quick and jarring cutscenes that tend to pop up right in the middle when you're doing things, as well as the morphine mode, where when you activate it, Violette suddenly is wearing her hospital gown and is running around with everything else basically in stasis, and blood drops appear all over the screen because reasons? I think they thought they were being really artistic with that, but it just is kinda cringy. But all of that is made so much worse by the game's color scheme.
Whenever I look at that color scheme, I see the darkness of mankind. We men are wretched things, and as such, the only colors appropriate to express this are brown and gray, and maybe a bit of red in the case of blood. And remember, the more you desaturate the colors, the less there is any color other than simply brown or really more gray. The more realistic it is, the more gritty it is, and the more you're going to understand that the developers want you to take this game deadly seriously. That you need to understand that every ounce of pain and misery Violette is going through needs to be felt on an existential level. And as such, what we have here with this brown and gray and realistic look is, as GameSpot put it, a powerful, unnerving look at one of history's darkest periods, because it's totally not an incredibly ugly look that makes the game look utterly ridiculous and make it damn near impossible to take the game seriously or anything.
Honestly, it's a real shame, because the visual quality is overall pretty solid for 2009, it's just that thanks to those aesthetics, it just looks downright ugly. And honestly, if you're gonna do that, you might as well just desaturate the colors completely and make the game purely black and white, because then at least you can claim that it's an aesthetic choice, that you're going for sort of a noir feel. But that is not remotely what they've done here, and it ends up really dragging the visuals down as a result. It also doesn't help that the sound design is a bit of a mess. The voice acting is generally decent, but nothing all that impressive. The Germans do at least speak German, and Violette herself is generally voiced pretty decently, but a lot of the dialogue itself is really cringe-inducing. Like, they're trying so very hard to make this thing gritty and edgy and depressing, and a lot of the time it's trying to do that, the dialogue is just so utterly ridiculous that you just can't take it seriously. And the same kind of thing happens when you move over into the music, or what passes for a soundtrack in this game, which I would describe as attempting something akin to a horror or thriller game or movie soundtrack, which means that whenever you get spotted, it starts hammering on the drums and acting like it's all super tense. And then as you're just wandering around trying to explore, most of it is some very light ambient stuff that most of the time you really don't even notice. And when you move into the sound effects themselves, they're generally pretty bland. They're not terrible, but most of the sound effects merely suffice and nothing more, and when you move into gun and explosion sounds, they're on the weaker side, unfortunately. So when you bring all of the presentation together, you not only end up with something that absolutely screams that it was made in the mid to late 2000s, early 2010s era, but the only real standout positive is the lighting, and that's certainly not enough to save the entire presentation from just being really lackluster overall. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and most of the story in this game is actually told in flashback sequences as the main protagonist, Violet Summer, a British spy, is laying comatose in a hospital somewhere in France. These flashbacks cover various missions Violet went on during the course of the war, and they involve things such as assassinating key targets, conducting acts of sabotage against the German war machine, and of course just general espionage, finding documents and intel, that sort of thing. Along the way, Violet narrates at least some of what's going on, and thus you have a general context as to what she was up to throughout the entire war, but you eventually realize that there's really not much of a story to this game at all. You're just playing through a bunch of disjointed missions that Violet went on, and then when Violet finally wakes up from her coma, it's basically the end of the game. You have one more level at that point, and that's it. And while you might think that since the game is being told from Violet's perspective and she's narrating the whole thing, you would get a good sense of what kind of character she is, but you really don't. I mean, sure, she monologues an awful lot, but most of what she's actually saying throughout the missions is just what she needs to be doing, as well as basically telling the player what to do. So she'll sit there and say something like, I needed to get into this building, but how did I do that? And then as you're wandering around and you're coming across new mechanics, she'll comment on them, like saying that she can shoot oil pools to set enemies ablaze and things like that. Aside from that, about the most personality she has is when she's monologuing while in the coma and just laying there thinking about things. And most of that is her saying incredibly cringy edgelord kind of stuff like, "We were inhuman beings, butchers on a field of corpses, corrupt and depraved. Only a sum of viscera, blood, and bone. Creatures without souls." And don't get me wrong, World War II was horrible and incredibly traumatic to the people who went through it. But the developers of Velvet Assassin were just trying way too damn hard to force this game to be gritty and dark and depressing, and they ended up going well past the point where that has any kind of emotional resonance and just becomes utterly ridiculous. It results in what minimal story and character the game has being reduced to something you cannot remotely take seriously. Which means it's ultimately up to the gameplay to save this thing. So what exactly are you getting out of Velvet Assassin? Well, as I mentioned at the start of this video, this is a stealth game, which means that most of what you're going to be doing is sneaking around, getting up behind enemies, and doing quick takedowns on them, sticking to the shadows, trying to make as little noise as you possibly can, and ultimately trying to get past enemies without being detected. Along the way, you'll be trying to complete various objectives, which include the likes of conducting acts of sabotage, or finding intel, or assassinating key targets. And once you've completed a mission, you'll get a mission accomplished screen that tells you how many kills you accomplished, how many collectibles you found, how long it took you, and how many experience points you earned, as well as giving you a rating, which is basically meaningless. The only thing you're really going to want to pay any attention to at all is the collectibles, because as you continue to get collectibles, you'll get extra experience points, and once you get 1,000 experience points, that will give you an upgrade star, which you can spend on one of 3 upgrade paths: Strength, Stealth, or Morphine. Strength just increases the amount of damage you can take. Stealth allows you to sneak more effectively by making your sneaking faster, and Morphine increases the duration of the Morphine mode, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Needless to say, this upgrade system is pretty rudimentary and really adds absolutely nothing to the game. It's like they put it in there more out of obligation than anything else. Because this was right around that time when damn near everything started having upgrade systems because they just felt like it was absolutely necessary, when most of the time it really isn't. And in this particular case, it adds absolutely nothing beneficial to the game at all, so it shouldn't have been put in there in the first place. Especially if it took time away from actually developing the stealth mechanics, because you see, the stealth mechanics in this game are actually rather simplistic. It basically consists of, are you crouched? If not, then you can be heard. If so, then you're basically silent. And are you in shadows and thus have this blue outline on your character? If so, you're basically invisible. If not, the enemy can probably see you, when their AI is actually functioning properly. Because it seems like a total crapshoot as to whether the enemy is actually going to detect you or not. Sometimes you can be standing right in front of them, very close to them, and they will not spot you. Other times, you'll be completely across the room and moving around as quietly as you can, and somehow they will still spot you, even though they can't actually see you and they certainly can't hear you. But even at the best of times, the enemy AI is still pretty dumb. About the best they do is just go on specific set patrolling paths, and a lot of the time that will take them across a trap that you can spring, like a switch box that you can throw to electrocute them to death. Or they'll just step into a pool of petrol and you can just shoot that, set it ablaze, and then they go up with it. It's pretty ridiculous. The main threat the enemies actually pose to you is that most of your ability to take them down is reliant on your ability to get behind them and then use the takedown prompt. The takedown prompt won't appear if you're taking the enemy head-on, at least unless you're in morphine mode, which again I'll talk about in a moment. And since you can take very little damage, it's best to avoid head-on confrontations, because you have a very limited supply of ammunition for your guns as well. I mean, sure, you'll probably start out a mission with a suppressed pistol, but you'll only get a very small number of rounds for it, and you need to make those shots count, because chances are you're not going to find replacement ammunition for it. Which of course makes perfect sense. I mean, after all, why the hell would the Germans have 45 ACP just laying around? They don't use it. So most of the time you're going to be trying to avoid using the guns as much as possible, at least until the game actively forces you to, because absolutely nothing screams this is a stealth game quite like having to run through an area and mow enemies down with shotguns and assault rifles. And I don't mean that in the kind of fun, okay, well, I've been sneaking this whole time, I got plenty of ammunition, screw it, let's just go loud just for this one section. I mean, the game literally forces you to run through an area and mow down enemies in your path because you have no way of sneaking past them. Because by far, the worst issue this game has is not its crappy AI or the weak upgrade system or the weak story, it's the level design. This is an extremely linear game to the point where there is basically no flexibility built into it all, except for the morphine mode. And even that is not flexible. There are several sections in the game where you will go into an area and the only way you can reliably get past it is to use the morphine mode to take down at least one enemy. Which of course brings up the question of what the hell morphine mode actually is. Well, it allows you to basically put the world in stasis and run in slow motion and your hospital gown until you find an enemy and you can just take them down instantly, whether you be behind them or right in front of them. The idea there being that it's your lifeline in case something goes wrong when you're trying to sneak around, and you can use it as a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card. You can only use it once before you had to find another morphine syringe somewhere in the level, and those are very sparsely placed out, so you have to be very judicious in their use. The problem there being that a lot of the time the game just forces you to use the morphine mode because there's really no way of getting through an area without using it. Because this isn't really so much a stealth game about avoiding detection as it is a game about doing exactly what the developer intends you to do at exactly the right time. Because if you happen to die in this game, which is incredibly easy to do because as I said, you can really take very little damage before going down, you're going to end up loading a checkpoint, which of course this game doesn't have a save anywhere feature. It's a console-centric game circa 2009. And as you might have surmised from all the things I've been saying thus far, they're not really getting the basics right, so the checkpoints are relatively few and far between. It's not the worst I've ever seen, but it's still pretty bad, so if you have to load a checkpoint, chances are it's going to be from a fair while ago and you're going to have to repeat a pretty decent chunk of the level. So you're going to want to make sure that you don't screw something up, and you're going to ultimately try to play the game more or less the exact way the developer wants you to and try to make as few mistakes as possible. Which is really difficult to do when the AI is as busted as it can be, when the mechanics are as simple as they are, and when there are so few ways to get out of a situation if you happen to screw something up. Because when you get spotted, you're either going to have to fight your way out, which is relatively easy to do when there's a very small number of guards wandering around, but if there's more of them, then the best you can really hope to do is run away, which is really difficult to do in a game that is so linear that there's basically nowhere you can run to. This results in some pretty frustrating trial and error, and it also results in several situations where you have to actively go against your instincts in a stealth game, which is to avoid detection, avoid enemies as much as you possibly can, try to ghost your way through, and in some cases you have to either blast your way out, or just use the morphine mode, go up and stab somebody in the face and then move past them. Not to mention the moments where it actively forces you to engage in combat, which is a frustrating affair thanks to the really crappy gunplay, which you would expect in a stealth game. It's not supposed to have good combat because you're not supposed to be fighting things unless you absolutely have to. It's almost like the developers really didn't understand exactly what it was they were making here, and you would think that by 2009 they would have a good grasp of how a stealth game works. I mean, we had had numerous entries in the Splinter Cell series, we had had all of the Thief games, and of course all of the Metal Gear Solid games, although they're certainly weaker in the stealth elements than Splinter Cell and Thief. Replay Studios definitely should have known better by this point, and apparently they just didn't, or they simply weren't able to. And the end result here is a stealth game that seems like it doesn't really want to actually be a stealth game. And even in the times where it is actively trying to be a stealth game, it just ends up being an absolutely crappy one. And as such, I really can't give this thing anything higher than a 1.5 out of 5. It is a downright bad stealth game that tries way too hard to be all gritty and dark and depressing, and just ends up being so utterly ridiculous you can't take it seriously. And then you can't even take the mechanics seriously, because those are either outright broken, or are weirdly glitching out at times, but other times they work kind of, or it's so turbo-linear that it actively interferes with being a stealth game, and that's when it isn't just saying screw it and becoming an incredibly crappy third-person shooter. And that's all an incredible shame, because the game's premise is fine. If they had done it well, then it could have been a really interesting and fun game. But as it stands, it's just an absolute mess that I really can't recommend to anybody. Thank you all very much for watching. I'll see you all in later videos.